Welcome to Lionfish University's Q&A about the lionfish invasion. I'm Stacy Frank. I am one of the co-founders of Lionfish University, and I'd like to introduce our two distinguished panelists today, Mr. Jim Hart, who is a noted screenwriter. He wrote the screenplays for Hook, for Contact, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and many other favorite films. And also like to introduce Dr. Steve Giddings, who is the chief scientist for the NOAA Marine Sanctuary System. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to give some background information about the lionfish information before we get in the Q&A portion of this. The first invasive lionfish was sighted off the coast of Dania Beach, Florida in 1985. And within short order, just a few years, the numbers had exploded exponentially. And they started migrating from the entire Western Atlantic through the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, down to South America. And it just has created a devastating marine ecological disaster. And there have been various variables that have contributed to this. One of them is the incredible reproductive rates that these fish have, creating 20 to 30,000 eggs every 2 to 3 days. And at least in the beginning of the invasion, there was no evidence of any predators eating either the fish or the eggs. There is some evidence now that that may be starting to happen. We're hoping so. Another factor with these fish that's so damaging is they are indiscriminate generalist predators, and they will eat just absolutely anything that will fit in their big round suction tube mouth, including native reef fish at huge numbers. Their stomachs will expand 30 times their normal size when they're eating. They'll eat stingrays, octopus, I mean, anything, mollusks. So it's set up a perfect storm to create a lot of damage on the reefs. And then I'd like to shift the focus a little bit here, talking about some of the social phenomena that has grown up around the lionfish invasion. Jim, can you tell us how you got interested in the lionfish invasion to begin with?
It's hard not to. It's hard not to get interested. I was a bit more mercenary about the lionfish invasion. I've always wanted to do another underwater monster fish movie like Jaws. And when I first encountered lionfish in Turks and Caicos in 2010, I'd never seen one before. And everybody was terrified of this small little, beautiful creature. And we would take 3 people to catch them in a net. You couldn't spear them. And then I joined you in Little Cayman to go diving with Dottie Benjamin. Again, lionfish had just been discovered in Little Cayman. And I began to imagine what would happen if they got, as big as a Volkswagen bus. So I was going to write a horror movie about the lionfish invasion with these giant lionfish that were like, spearing people and sticking people and stinging people and eating people and swallowing people. And I couldn't get anybody interested in Hollywood because nobody knew what a lionfish was. And what happened when we got involved in this, and before we met Steve, suddenly the impact the lionfish were having on the environment and what we were learning about the lionfish seemed much more important than trying to cash a check on a Hollywood movie. That's changed in a while. So now maybe we'll go back and try to sell the giant lionfish movie. The other thing that happened, I began to meet people like Steve that I would never have met in a million years. Not even in a bar or a used car lot or maybe an airplane, an airline. What began to happen, you begin to notice that this invasion brings people together that never would have met, never would have associated with each other. It's almost like a war movie where you're in the boat going in to land on the beach, or you're in the parachute going out the parachute, and you're next to a plumber and a lawyer and an accountant and a truck driver and an astrophysicist, a retired airplane pilot. Suddenly you're associated with all these different kinds of people whose lives have been brought together because of this invasion, and only because of this invasion. I have relationships now with people that I call very close friends that wouldn't have met them in a million years. And we certainly wouldn't have gone out of our way to meet each other, maybe on a dive trip or something. But that's really what's happened with this invasion. It has created social relationships and economic relationships and actually working together to fight this invasion, just like a World War II movie.
And how have you seen the lionfish
Stacy,
invasion?
Yeah.
can I add something to that, Stacy?
Sure. Uh-huh.
Because you think of science oftentimes being separate from a lot of other social enterprises, but the truth is, to actually turn science into action, it takes social networks like this to implement practices that are going to solve problems. So we never could have done this science on lionfish and implemented corrective measures that we have started to do without creating the same kind of relationships that Jim's talking about. So those are just as valuable, the relationships he described, to the scientists who have been involved in the lionfish invasion, professionally, and I got to say personally, because I feel exactly the same way that Jim does. The relationships I've built through this they're life-changing things, because they're people that I know for the rest of my life I'm going to rely on and value, and hopefully do a lot of other things with beyond lionfish once this problem is solved, assuming it is. These people are they're salt of the earth type folks from every walk of life. And, I count them among the closest friends I have now.
And Jim, what changes have you seen in people's lives because of the invasion? What specific sorts of changes?
Wow. Well, let's take Ali El-Haj, for instance. Ali was an architect. Ali did not dive. He fished. He was in Curacao. He came from Curacao. He had a graphic design and was an architect in Florida. And a friend of his in Curacao showed him lionfish and said, "Can you make me something to trap the lionfish in once I spear them?" And Ali had never even been under the water, never scuba dived. So Ali designed the Zookeeper, which has become the industry standard for containment units for catching lionfish and storing them safely when you used to call it a stuff and go. Zookeeper is now like Kleenex. It has become the name, even though it's a brand name, to describe a containment unit. Zookeeper is fun to say. So Ali's life changed. He quit. He shut down his architect business. He began to manufacture zookeepers in his garage, and they're all over the world. They're the gold standard for safety and capturing and containing lionfish while you're swimming underwater. I would say Ali's life changed big time. Our other friend in Florida, Rachel Bowman, lionfisher queen of forever. Her life completely changed when she began to spear lionfish and make a living. It got her out of certain bad relationships. It got her out of the house. It put her in a world that's usually controlled and run by men and with commercial fishermen. She started spearing lionfish and got her own boat, which is called the Britney Spears. And you hear her talk about it. She gets emotional about what the lionfish invasion did to change her life. And over and over and over again, and people are leaving where they grew up and moving to certain places to relocate, to be closer to the people going into science. The young man that I had Steve talk to, who's going to the University of A&M in Corpus Christi to study marine biology, because of his fascination with seeing our Facebook posts online with lionfish. So I don't think you don't have to look very far to see someone's life changed because of the lionfish invasion.
Jim, could you talk about the ladies in Belize for a second?
Oh, absolutely.
Speaking of major change.
No kidding. There's a program in Belize where they're teaching the local indigenous women how to make jewelry out of lionfish fins and lionfish spines. And it's given them an opportunity to earn money for the family, just like the fishermen, their husbands or their daughters are going out and spearing fish to eat and to sell. They're using the other parts of the fish to make jewelry out of. that's become one of our biggest sellers at our drive shows is lionfish jewelry. So even, I mean, that's a great example, Steve, of how all aspects of this invasion, there's now research programs and grants being given that didn't exist 5 years ago to research lionfish, or especially 10 years ago.
I'm kind of a small player when it comes to research on lionfish, at least research on the fish specifically. But I've used what a lot of other people have done to develop a trap that we believe catches lionfish, but also reduces some of the impacts of other kinds of traps on fish, including things like bycatch, catching things you don't want to catch. The trap I've designed doesn't catch anything really but lionfish, except small numbers occasionally of other species. But those species can be put back in the trap when the traps are put back in the water and recompressed and taken back down to the bottom. So theoretically, you won't have mortality of other species, but you will catch lionfish. And they also don't have bottom impacts because they're such lightweight and small traps that only touch the bottom in 2 spots before they open. So you really don't have the impacts on the bottom that other traps do. And we're trying to minimize other impacts of those traps too, things like entanglement. We don't want whales or turtles or dolphins or anything getting caught in the lines from the trap to the surface that mark the traps. So we're trying to figure out ways to reduce any other impacts that these traps could have. But as long as we can reduce those impacts, and also another one being when you lose traps, a lot of times box traps and lobster traps and so forth, they'll continue to capture fish and capture lobsters, and serial mortality starts to occur inside the trap. One species killing another, killing another, killing another. But these lionfish traps are broad opening traps. They're called non-containment traps because they just lay on the bottom and they're only closed when the operator comes and retrieves the trap. So if they were lost, they wouldn't create this problem we call ghost fishing, which is continual fishing following their loss. So the traps themselves are simple mechanical traps, no electronics, although there are other people working on electronic traps, so those are worth continual investigation as well. But these are non-electronic mechanical traps that they fold in half and they look like a half moon. They're hemispherical but they're flat. So when they go down through the water, they go down perpendicular through the water. And when they hit the bottom, they have small extensions that force the jaws open and apart so that the trap lays flat on the bottom. And extending up from the middle of the trap is a large piece of plastic that we call a FAD, a fish aggregation device. All it is a piece of structure that lionfish are attracted to. And a lot of fish are attracted to structure, but no fish as much as lionfish. Lionfish come from around a certain size area, will start hovering around this piece of plastic that sticks up from the middle of the trap and just stay there until they go out hunting, and then they'll leave for a while and come back, and it becomes their home, their little habitat for rest between hunting episodes. And the trap fishermen can come back at any time, preferably when the lionfish are there, not when they're off hunting. So you've got to know a little bit about lionfish behavior, not to pull your traps at the wrong time. But when these traps are pulled, the net is quite loose on the traps, so the frames close around the fish, the lionfish, and the net stays loose around the trap, creating a big globe, basically, so that the net doesn't hit the fish before the trap is completely closed. But once the trap is closed, the net can collapse on the fish, but that's too late. The fish can't get out. And then the trap is simply pulled to the surface. So it's a very simple trap. The real trick now is we've done all the scientific testing to prove that they catch lionfish and how many fish they catch over certain periods of time. But the next step, and the big one, and the costly one, is the commercial trap testing. That's working with commercial fishermen who might normally fish for lobster or some other species, to get them to start to use this model of trap in the off season, probably, to catch lionfish. And if that project works out and we are able to prove and get fishermen hooked on these traps, we'll be in business. We can start taking lionfish now out of deep water when we never could before, because spear fishermen are limited to shallower depths than these traps are.
And hopefully we can help meet that great, huge demand in the marketplace that is existing because of how great these fish taste.
Yeah, we do know there's demand out there that, and restaurants buy them up, wholesalers buy them up. It's very easy to sell lionfish. We just need to get fishermen convinced that they can catch enough in a short period of time
Right.
for them to make extra money or make money during, the year round on fishing. Right now, lobster fishermen, for example, are limited to a certain period of time during the year when they're allowed to go out fishing. So they have non-fishing times of the year.
Mhm.
And presumably we could get approvals to use lionfish traps during that time of the year. And lobster fishermen would be able to become lionfish fishermen for the remainder of the year.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining the conversation today. And in closing, I'd like to end on a high note about the silver lining behind this lionfish invasion. We've kind of all alluded to the fact there are economic opportunities for people that are involved in removing these invasive fish with selling the meat. These have been a whole cottage industry growing up around lionfish jewelry making, which I have a lionfish ring on right now made from the fins of invasive lionfish. And then there's a lot of beautiful artwork now that's being created based on this gorgeous but deadly fish. And so it's at least there is something good that comes out of all of this. And what Jim was talking about, the Mediterranean invasion, that is just exploding right now exponentially, the numbers of fish there. So stay tuned for the next plot twist in the story of the invasive lionfish. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Doc.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Stacy.
guys.
The Patty sign for lionfish.
Yay.
Hey.